All right, folks, gather around. I think the coffee's done. If it isn't, some of you are disappointed in what you're drinking. Last week, it was my intention to take up the four loves. We got distracted, so this week we're going to take it up. This is a little book that I heard about. And I thought, well, that sounds really interesting. And so I got it, and I read it, and by golly, it was very interesting. C.S. Lewis, we did Mere Christianity about a year ago or so. C.S. Lewis is just very outstanding at sort of boiling things down to very common sense, but also very profound truths. And he just does a great job of that. And he did a really excellent job here. You know, we talk about the sort of the basic Christian moral principle boils down to this thing called love. And so we use that word a lot. We're supposed to love one another. We're supposed to love God and so on. But we oftentimes don't really break down what we mean a lot by this. And so that's what this book was about, different senses of the word love. And we're not just discussing it from the point of view of language, but from the point of view of that there are various, we use the word love a lot to mean things that really really mean more like I like this or I like that. But there are various uses of the word love that are truly profound and human, that human beings do this. But there are different senses of what we mean by love, and he's going to discuss these, and we're going to discuss these. And it's light, and that is, you know, I think it'll open your eyes to just the different ways in which human beings experience love and are loved, and some comments that he makes about these, which I found very, very enlightening and helpful. He calls it the four loves because ultimately we are going to discuss four different fundamental ways in which human beings experience and give love, okay? But first, he begins his little volume by discussing two ideas. And he calls them need love and gift love. So before we get into any of the various kinds of ways in which we talk about human beings loving one another, he goes into the distinction between love, which we need, we must have, we do not thrive without, and love, which we as human beings must give. So as a human being, God has made us such that we do not thrive without love. And in many cases, we must love, or we are not thriving, we are not being human. When this isn't happening, something bad is going wrong. He begins by talking about need love. He says, you know, I didn't, when I first started to talk or think about this, I couldn't believe that need love was really love at all. The idea is what we need. And by the whole idea of love is it's what we give. And so since it's what we give, then how can something that we have to have be love? But he just had to admit, he said, you know, I started out with that assumption, but the more I went on, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I just can't get around it. There are certain kinds of genuine love that we human beings must have. By God's own design, we must have it. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But I just want to bring out the distinction between love, which we must give to be fully human, and love, which we must receive, okay? Or we're not in a good situation, all right? So let's talk about the first of four ways. Need love and gift love are not two different kinds of love. These might apply to any of these loves, okay? So we'll talk about that. But so first, the first chapter, when he starts talking about the four loves, is he talks about affection, okay? And by affection, he means something more than merely warm, fuzzy puppies. He uses, for example, the primary example of affection, the primary illustration of it. He says, think of a mother with her child, her baby. Okay, and there you have an archetypical picture of affection. It's natural, deeply human, and extremely powerful. Affection is what we have in families, deep affection for one another. And he comments a little bit about sort of some of the qualities of affection. And one of them is, affection really is not dependent upon the character or the person that you have affection for. We oftentimes have affection for people who aren't very lovable, but for some reason or another, we just form this attachment. Babies are the beneficiaries of an instant affection. You don't know the baby. All it does is cry and make your life a mess. It doesn't matter. You love the child. We say love, but this is a particular kind of love, and we'll see how it's different than other kinds of loves that we have. But so he said this is perhaps one of the most elemental and profound human emotions that ties parents to children, children to parents, and families together. But not only that, but that's just where we see it most powerfully. And it happens viscerally, without even having to think about it, and oftentimes arises in situations where there's deep familiarity. We tend to have affectionate attachments toward things for which we gain a tremendous amount of familiarity. So for example, if you work with somebody for a very, very long time, it might be that you don't necessarily even like them that much, but you might develop an affection for them. And people that you may not really trust or like or have much in common with, but just because you spend so much time with them. Well, an affection sort of goes more broadly than this. Affection, we tend to have, again, affection for things for which we are very familiar. So we all favor our own communities over somebody else's community because we're familiar with our community, okay? If you grow up in the South, you like Southern culture. It's just the way it is. And you go up north and you don't necessarily not like that, but there's something about coming back home that instantly grabs at your heartstrings. This is the same basic idea that you have with patriotism. We have a tendency, human beings, to have an affection for and an affinity for that which is familiar to us. And so, for example, if you go overseas and spend a long time overseas in foreign countries where nobody speaks English, you may learn to get along and you may learn to appreciate the various cultural differences between here and there. Then you hear somebody speaking English, and particularly with an American accent, and it's like right away, you don't know anything else about this person, but it's home, okay? And so this is a very natural thing. It's similar to the kind of love that we have in families. We grow up with one another. We learn one another's ways, the good, the bad, and everything else. We're comfortable with one another, and we prefer our own families to other people's families, okay? In a very natural way, most of the time. That's right. So now, so this is a very powerful emotion. It is real. It is God-given. It is natural. You don't have to be a Christian to have affection. You just have to be not a sociopath, okay? And so this is but one way, which is universal. Doesn't matter what culture you go through. People will have these very strong affinities in their own families, and they will have an affinity for their own language, their own culture, their own nation, and so on. And then he makes, and he's going to make this observation about each of these four loves, or actually three of the four loves. And that is that they have their downsides. Okay, that it's not an automatic good. So you can say affection is automatically good, but affection does and can lead to things that aren't very good, okay? So, for example, it's very easy to sort of move from the I prefer my family because they are my family and we're familiar with one another and all of that, to begin to imagine that your family really is better than other families, rather than just different. This is what you're familiar with. They think their family is better. You don't necessarily. You can have this kind of affection and realize that your kid really isn't more beautiful and smarter than all the other kids. You may know that that's not true, but sometimes you forget, and you may start thinking that that's true. Consider the most extreme example of this. You know, the sort of patriotism that's my country, right or wrong, okay? Where you are so fiercely patriotic that you no longer ask the question whether your country is doing what's right or wrong, or whether we're actually victimizing other countries or things like that. Well, this can be an example. Think of the mafia and how their family, you know, they're just we'll murder everybody, but when it's family, you know, that's a different story. So on the one hand, that's kind of nice, and pretty, and beautiful, and profound, and on the other way, not right. And that's what he means when he says there's a certain aspect of affection that isn't necessarily good. It's not necessarily bad. It's just that ungoverned affection as a natural thing, a product of human beings, can lead to bad places. For example, think about where Jesus says, anybody who loves his mother or father more than me is not worthy of me. What's he saying there? Is he really saying not to have affection for your mother or father? Absolutely not. The commandments command it, but even if the commandments didn't command it, it just happens automatically. So Jesus is not saying don't have affection for your own mother or father. But there are times when that affection for your mother and father might be a problem. For example, if your mother and father, even your own mother and father, are opposed to your coming into the kingdom, for example, if they are calling you away from Christ and Christ is calling you to him, Christ isn't calling you to reject your parents, but your parents might very well be putting pressure on you to reject Christ. And that's when Jesus says, if even your own mother or father, okay, if you love them more than me, what he means is, if your affection for your mother and your father cause you not to follow me, then you are not worthy of me, which means you've made the wrong choice, okay? Why would anybody make that choice? Why would Jesus use mother or father? Because affection is a powerful thing. And this is one of the reasons why it can sometimes be very difficult for the Christian faith to break into an insular family that does not believe, because then you become the nut, okay? And nobody wants to be the nut. And if mom and dad are looking down on you, or brother and sister are looking down on you because you've decided to become a religious fanatic, well, nobody wants to be a religious fanatic and a nut, so I just won't, okay? Well, but that's exactly what now it works the other way too, of course. If mom and dad love the Lord, our natural affections for our mom and dad make it much easier for us to love the Lord too. Point being that affection isn't an automatic good. Patriotism is a good thing, but untempered, it can lead to bad results. Affections between parents and children can be good, but what happens when a mother so loves her child that she simply can't recognize when her son or daughter is doing wrong and goes in and argues with the teacher because the teacher's trying to, but you can't reach them because this is my son and this is my daughter and they've never done that. They would never do a thing like that. And in that case, affection is strong and powerful and good. He uses this example of how destructive this can be. Imagine, picking on poor moms, could be a dad too, that is so obsessed with their child that they don't let them grow up, okay? You won't let them take risks. You won't allow them to spread their wings. You won't let them move out, okay? Now, of course, what this is not just a product of affection. This is also a product of the problem with the mom or the dad, okay? When dad tries to live vicariously through the child You're going to learn to play baseball, and you're going to learn to play it well, no matter that you can't pick up a ball. No, we're going to make a professional out of you sooner or later. And the kid can be destroyed because the father is living through the child. But it's also, there's a lot of affection there. But the problems in the father gets translated into the child. And so you can have all kinds of problems. So just bear that in mind. Affection is natural, universal, very, very powerful, and for the most part, a very, very good thing, but it is not automatically good all the time, okay? It needs to be governed, and we'll come back to that in a minute. All right, any thoughts on that? See, I just thought that it was a very nice little discussion there where he talks about affection, and using the word affection at first kind of was off-putting because I'm thinking, well, that's not really what, but then when he starts discussing what I really mean is the love that we have for other people because they are around us, not necessarily because they're like us or that they deserve it. Yes?
And he thought of it in that terms, but there's a group of fishermen up in Alaska, of Russian descent, all of them have long last names, and they all...
Unpronounceable?
Yeah, and they all stick together, and they build their own boats, they do everything the same. All of them have the same jet drives, and we're trying to break into that market. We do. All of them will have ours eventually.
Yeah.
But one of the things that hurts them from their affection is they build their own boats. They build them out of fiberglass. They're the only ones in Bristol Bay fishery that have fiberglass boats. And it hurts them in certain areas, but that's the way they do it.
But that's the way they do it, yeah. And that can be another example of sort of my country, right or wrong. This is the way it should be, and anybody who does it a different way is inferior or wrong. Well, you don't learn very well that way. I mean, sometimes you might be right. Sometimes you might be wrong and blinded to that fact. All right, so the next one he calls friendship. And here he's going to draw a distinction between affection, which can come between two very unequal people, like a parent and a child, or somebody that you work with and you know, you like them in a certain way, you want to give them a hug. But that's different than friendship, where he says, friendship, I want you to imagine, and he's going to talk about two men, and he says two men have a friendship. He says, I want you to imagine that the two men are standing side by side, facing forward together, okay? And this is sort of the way he discusses it, the essential feature of friendship that we will call love. Now then, he also says, and this is in 1947, somewhere around in there, 1950, when he wrote this. He already had the disclaimer. He said, love between two men of this sort has nothing to do with homosexuality. And all the way back then, he's having to, you know, sort of apologize for, but he said, this has not, go back and study the ancients and you will see that this kind of friendship was considered the highest kind of relationship between human beings. Whether you agree with that or not, they considered it extremely valuable. And it's built on mutual respect and sort of a common view on something, okay? It might be a common view on a lot of things. It might be a common view of our mission. It may be lifelong. It may be, you know, while we're deployed until the war is over, you know, you just become, but it may be on how you build boats, okay? A fascination with and a love of building boats or whatever it happens to be. But the idea here is that there's an idea of mutual respect. You see things in a similar way to men or to women. He said it can be a man and a woman, okay, but it often is not. This book, by the way, would transgress in many ways on many sexist, you know, it's hopelessly quaint in many ways, that we would consider today. Although, you might look at this and say, I don't consider that quaint at all. That's the way it actually is. But let's just say he just run roughshod over modern sensibilities, okay, whether those modern sensibilities are any good or not. He is more than happy to sort of speak in terms of stereotypes with men and women and how they generally are. He's not being mean about it. It's just that's how he's seeing it. Well, anyway, so you've got two men, and they have sort of a shared view. Or you can have 3 or 4 men who have this kind of friendship that is a mutual respect and a similar vision over someone or several things, where they just, it's kind of the, I like the way you think, I like the way I think when I'm around you kind of a thing. It just, this person makes you better, and you speak the same language, and you see the world in a similar way. This to him is the essence of what he means by friendship that can become very, very intense and very deep, okay, and very profound. That two men or two women can love one another very, very deeply on a very intimate level, and there's absolutely nothing immoral about any of this. It is the sharing of two minds. Actually, he calls it the most angelic of the loves, in the sense that it is a sharing in the minds. There's nothing visceral about this, whereas with affection, it's just, it can happen. You didn't even want it to, but there it is. This one is more of a choice. It's more of a, like I said, a meeting of the minds. And it can be a very, very beautiful thing. We are scared of it in our, the whole disclaimer regarding homosexuality will indicate that even back then, men more than women have difficulty engaging in this kind of a relationship without feeling awkward and without feeling like, you know, this is not right. Now, we'll talk about the kind of relationship where this would not be right, but simply having two men or two women who have a deep and intense like and respect and share very deeply with one another, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, nothing forbidden. Quite the contrary. It is actually a very beautiful illustration of one of the things that human beings do that other creatures do not and cannot do, and it is something to be celebrated and looked for, okay? Sometimes hard to get. There can be a downside in this kind of love too, this kind of friendship love, and he basically points out that this kind of love, by its nature, two men find out that they just really like one another. They see things similarly, or three, or whatever. What happens is, by the very nature of this, if you've got two men that really see things really similarly and are really close to one another, there becomes a division between them and everybody else. Now, this is not necessarily hostile, but quickly will arise an us and them, okay? We're not necessarily looking down on the others, but hey, these two have their own thing going on. And they speak to one another's hearts and minds in a way that the rest of us just can't penetrate there. And when this goes wrong, okay, then we can get kind of some ugly things like cliques or little clubs where nobody else can get in. The other point that he makes is that oftentimes a thing can start out as a friendship or a series of friendships, and it can end up being this kind of cliquey, clubbish sort of a thing, where what it used to be is that we have mutual respect, and now what we have is we have we have our own inner circle, and if you're not in that inner circle, then you're just not there. Okay, you're just not one of the players. This is now at this point. He points out that at this point, this has nothing to do with mutual respect anymore. This is pride run amok. This is elitism and sort of exclusivity, which we can fall into, and it may have started in a very positive way, but it can degenerate so that two people who have a deep friendship, or three, or a group, you know, that just can become insular and sort of exclude the rest of the world, which is a downside of this. So, like with affection, it's not an automatic good, and just left ungoverned, the more is not necessarily the better. It can become imbalanced and create problems. You could see that in a church, it could very easily be that way, that all of us may share a lot in common in the way we think, and you might expect that, although we might have many differences about the different kind of hobbies we have or the different kind of politics or stuff like that. However, at least in something as deep and profound as our understanding of the Lord and His workings in our life, we have a common view of that, and other things that may relate to that. And then somebody else tries to break in. So this is sometimes, I think, a hazard in the church. We all like one another, okay? We're friends with one another. We may be very much friends with one another, and it can make it difficult for a person who is not part of the group to get in. And now, of course, we may not be doing that, and they may imagine we are, because when you're trying to break in, it may feel that way, or we may be doing that. We may be not accepting this person in, or these people, because they're changing the dynamic of the congregation, for example. So ungoverned, it's not always good. And so it also is a love that is natural, good, angelic, as C.S. Lewis would say, the least of the visceral sort. All right, now let's talk about the next thing that we refer to as love, Eros. Now, this is the root behind erotic, for example. But here, he makes the point that this is larger than just the physical side of this. However, there is a physical component of this. So this is the kind of love that is meant to pass between a man and a woman. It involves a desire for sexual intimacy. However, it goes beyond that, well beyond that. In fact, the true and deepest sense of this eros, the physical, is not necessarily the primary or the first thing. But it may be more of a desire. This man just can't get this woman out of his mind. And everything that she does is just the most wonderful thing that's ever been, and vice versa. You just fall in love with every little mannerism and every little habit of the other person. You want to know everything about them. You want to be around them all the time. When you're not around them, you're just miserable and thinking about them constantly. Well, this is the stuff of all of your love ballads and so much poetry and so many songs and so on. So we're all quite familiar. And oftentimes when we use the word love, this is what's popping into our head. I want you to note, however, that we've talked about two other senses of the word love that are very different than this, that are actually more common, especially the affection one. Now, the highest and most beautiful and fullest expression of eros is the Christian understanding of marriage. You have a man and a woman who truly do share their entire lives, including a physical element of their entire lives, and they are coming together in the same way that Christ loves and gives himself for the church, and the result is life. Okay? So this is a very special aspect of human beings' capacity and desire to love and be loved. And it reaches its highest expression here. Now, here, in this type of love, we have the most obvious way in which a thing is not, doesn't govern itself very well, okay? And we must be very careful, because when people say things like, the love conquers all kind of an idea, or how could it be wrong if it feels so right kind of an idea, this is a great way in which an ungoverned, very natural love can go terribly, terribly wrong. In our culture, and again, he's speaking in the 1950s, he's saying in our culture, we have so exalted the physical and the body that overwhelms everything else, so that becomes the mystical, perfect, you are most genuinely your authentic self when you are physically giving yourself to another person, and this is the most you. And of course he would say that's ridiculous, but that's how we often think of it. He actually goes on, it was kind of amusing, he starts making fun of the human body. He said, there are many philosophers that have done this. Many philosophers have just laughed and laughed and laughed at the human body and the disparity between the mind, which soars to such heights, and the body, which drags us down constantly. Drags us down with sickness, but also drags us down with embarrassing things that it does and the needs that it has and all this kind of stuff. Where, as exalted and wonderful as you are in your mind, in the end, you're doing the same thing that squirrels do. I mean, let's face it. And so it keeps us very, very humble, and that's a good thing. But the way this in our current culture has so exalted this to be above everything else that it's like, well, but look at our society today, which is much worse than it was in his day, and he already was talking about it. Do you understand that if you try to tell somebody that they cannot have sex with whoever they want, you are somehow denying, you might as well be denying them air and food and water. It is that essential that they be able to do this. People talk that way. Now, a rational person would step back and say, no. I mean, I'm not saying that this isn't important, but is it all-encompassing and essential like that? Really? And the answer is no, not really. But it sells stuff. And it makes for good politics a lot of times. But the idea that love is so fundamental that however it manifests itself in an individual human being must be respected. You will note that when I said the highest expression of this is Christian marriage, we might think that even a non-Christian marriage, if it's something of a mirror of marriage, also illustrates some of the beauty of this. But there is a function and a purpose to this, and it finds its fulfillment in marriage and family and children. Okay, which quite naturally involves men and women, and there's a reason why traditionally marriage is understood as a lifelong union, and it's one that calls for a great deal of sacrifice on the part of each for the other, and which is sort of not centered, but has as this feature which none of the other loves have, this desire for the physical, okay, which is good and God-given, but like affection, natural, and can easily get totally out of balance and lead to very, very bad things. In our society, the sex has been, the physical part of this has been plucked out and made a thing unto itself, where whole industries are devoted just to this, which is an example of a love which has become unhinged and left to go wherever it wants. You have other ways in which this kind of love can become just unmanageable. So when you have men and women who become so infatuated with one another, they just would sell their soul to have this other person. And there's another way in which it may be that every fiber in your body wants this other person, but let's face it, you're already married, okay? A lot of bad things have happened because people have fallen in love, as we say, because that's normally what we mean when we say fall in love. This is the kind of love we're talking about. Once in a while, we may talk about affection that way, but it's more of a light touch. But when we normally say, I've fallen in love with this person, what we mean is this kind of love. I have this all-encompassing desire. And whether you're married or not, whether it's the same sex or not, whether there's any sense in which this could lead to anything good, doesn't matter. Because I must have this other person. And the wreckage which has been brought on our culture and our world because this aspect of love just gets totally out of hand and unbridled. So here's another example of something that is good, but not always and necessarily and only good. It can go bad. Now, let's also talk and go back and revisit this idea of need love and gift love. Parents need or just naturally give love to their children. Okay? If you didn't want to, too bad. You will, and you will do it. You just can't make a parent stop. But the children absolutely need this. They are dependent, not just physically, for the things to eat and shelter and so forth. They are dependent upon this kind of absolute love of their parents emotionally. Or bad things happen to kids as they grow up if they don't have that kind of assurance of the love of their parents or of their family. We need to have it. Husbands and wives need to have the love of one another. They need to be able to express and give. They need to have somebody to love. But they also need to be loved. In other words, it fills a human need that we are loved. Okay? Friendship may be a little bit different. We may have a psychological desire for this, but the need for the other two kinds of love, particularly for the affection. I mean, who can live in a world where nobody is close to you at all? That's hard. So you see how the need love and the gift love go throughout all of these different sort of natural needs and desires that human beings have. And note the wonderful ways in which we are interrelated to one another. And we use the same word, love, for all of these things. And there's a clear relationship between them, but we also see that, yeah, but these are different kinds and senses of the word love. All of them are, we think of them as good, but I think it is wise for us to realize that they are not necessarily good, can get out of balance, can take us places where we should not go. Okay? And it doesn't matter how it feels, and it doesn't matter how it seems. If these things are ungoverned, they can take you to places that seem good and aren't. Okay? That gets us to the final of these four loves. He calls it charity. Now, we'll call it agape, because that's what it's translating. And this was the King James translation of this agape love, charity. Now, he admitted, even when he's writing, that charity has some connotations that are not the same as what goes with agape, but that's what he was working with because that was the traditional word. Agape love is a Christ-like, a God-like love. In other words, it is looking outward, not inward. It is not seeing what it needs and is trying to satisfy itself, but it is looking outward, and it is looking genuinely to the best interests of others and what is for their welfare. Okay? So, as Christ moves through the world, he is continually looking at people, and when it says he loves them, it's talking about him truly having their welfare in mind. When it talks about how Jesus laid down his life for us, that in this way God showed his love, that Christ died for us. What it means is not that Jesus had tremendous affection for us, okay, or that he was friends with us in the sense that we're talking about here. And certainly not the Eros type, although there is that metaphorical version of it, right? Christ and his bride. But it's talking about this agape love. Christ really is willing and ready to lay down his life that we might live. Okay? Now, when Jesus says to us that we should love even our enemies, he clearly does not mean affection. You're not going to have affection for your enemies. He clearly does not mean friendship. He clearly does not mean eros. He means this, okay? That we should love and actually have the welfare even of our enemies in mind before our own welfare. When the scripture says you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and strength, it means that we should have God's interests and devotion to God above our own. We should love our neighbor as ourselves. It means that our hearts should be turned outward to others and their needs rather than inward toward meeting our needs. Okay? Now, of all of the loves described here, this is the one and the only love which is a positive good all the time. Okay? It does not get imbalanced. The more you have of it, you can't have too much. All right? And this is the love which must be the governing principle on all the other loves. Affection can go sour As beautiful as it is and as natural as it is, it can go sour and accomplish ugly things. It must be governed by this agape love. Likewise with friendship, to keep friendship from going sour, to keep Eros from going sour, from going places where it is actually ugliness which is being served and a total inward turning. We must have this. So let's back up, and this is not something that C.S. Lewis talked about. He mentioned it. But it's sort of strung throughout. And that is, there's an ancient way of talking about, I think this goes back to St. Augustine, probably goes back earlier than that, but it describes sin and sinfulness as what it says, it's being turned in on yourself, okay? So I've pointed out before, for example, that if I was to ask the typical person, what's the opposite of love? The answer is almost always hate. But that is not really correct. The opposite of love is selfishness, okay? The opposite of putting your needs and your interests above my own is putting my needs and my interests above yours, okay? And a very selfish person is always thinking about what they're going to get and what they're going to get out of life. Notice that all of these loves can degenerate into that too, so that a parent can use their children and their deep affection for them becomes a crutch. I can't live without you, so I must make sure that you never move away, okay? They're never going to say that, but that's what's really going on. Eros often turns into two people using one another. It feels great, but they're using one another. They're not really looking up for the interests of the other person. They're trying to fill a hole in their own heart and their own needs. Likewise with friendships and all this. You're using the other person to give you something you need rather than actually trying to give for the other person. Agape never does that. If it does that, it's not agape anymore. The whole notion here is that the way you keep affections from going south, and the way you keep friendship from going south, and the way you keep the proper love between a man and a woman from going south and producing sin and ugliness, is it must be governed by this outward turned understanding of love that is demonstrated for us in the life of Jesus himself, okay? That Jesus lived for us, he died for us, he lives for us still. And when the scripture talks about God loving us, that's what it means, okay? And when it calls Christians to love one another, that's what it is talking about. These other things will happen naturally, okay? Jesus isn't commanding us to be friends with our enemies. He's commanding us to love them. Friendship develops when you have a mutual respect and a kind of a similar way of viewing things. Affection happens when you're just around somebody all the time, and who knows why it happens. Sometimes it just happened. You don't know why. And there's nothing wrong with that, so long as it's governed always by this agape. Now, charity, in the original idea here, charity meant you were doing something good for somebody else without their necessarily deserving it, okay? It's not that they did deserve it or they didn't deserve it. It's just that has nothing to do with it. It's the need that is causing you to do this and your desire to help another person. And so charity, that had a very, very positive thing. But of course, it has since become sort of an act of pity. I pity you, and therefore I will help you, okay? Which, I mean, isn't necessarily bad, but that's not exactly what is meant by the original use of the word charity, and certainly not what is meant. Agape love does not mean, even though it is oftentimes used that way, I love you as a Christian, it means I don't love you at all, all right? But I'm constrained to do this for some reason or another. Okay, so there you have the four loves. I thought it was an excellent discussion of some things that are very familiar to us all, but I had never really broken it down in this way and recognized that you know, these things which are very good and very natural and very beautiful have their ways of going sour, and that the way that keep them from going sour is the Christ-like love that we are taught by Jesus, and that will keep things from turning ugly. Any thoughts or observations on any of this? I have like 2 or 3 minutes here before I start getting in trouble, so don't ask me anything that's going to get me in trouble. But That's it.
And I was going to call, I didn't join any, but for fraternities fit into the friendship thing.
Oh, sure. Yeah, any kind of cliques, and you don't, these things.
It's very strong, apparently, because my son-in-law, he'll run into somebody who hadn't seen in years, fraternity brother.
Yeah.
And they immediately trust them on whatever he wants to do or whatever.
Yes, and we can kind of see how that might go bad. Yeah, or the whole idea of classes. Economic classes can easily be this way. You know, all the rich and hoity-toity just automatically support one another, side one another. You're the in class or you're not the in class. It has nothing to do anymore with friendship and seeing things a similar way. Okay, and it's not affection either, but it is this kind of a cliquish thing that can develop. You can see some good in it. You know, I like you because we both have similar tastes in fine art. As for me, you know, my art comes from Walmart, so I don't fit. I won't get there.
Where's your jet come from?
Where's my jet? Yes. Or who am I wearing today? Who am I wearing? I have no idea. Land's End. That's who I'm wearing. Land's End. Anything else? All right. Well then, hey, you know what? I will get started getting ready for the service before I'm frantic about it. How about that? Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you for all the beautiful things that you've given to us simply because we are human beings living in this world, for the beautiful emotions that you give to us, for the capacity of human beings to love one another in all kinds of different ways. But Lord, we pray that you would teach us above all, that we would learn to love one another as you have loved us. For this is not only a good in and of itself, but it also keeps these other ways in which we would love one another in a God-pleasing light, and keeps us, Lord, from using and hurting one another and hurting society while we try to fill our own needs. So teach us, Lord, not to be turned inwardly, but to be turned outwardly, and in this way, model your love for us. Amen.